everyone, Known a Consequence here, back with another episode of my Give the People What They Want series. So it's pretty well known by now that Dan I recently apologized to Luke Gygax for how the Gygax family has been treated by WotC for many years now. If you haven't seen the actual clip where Luke Gygax talks about it, here is the thumbnail for the video I made. It's the second clip featured in the video. To review, the single biggest source of the insults appeared in this book, The Making of Original Dungeons & Dragons, published in June 2024. When you open the book's cover, one of the very first things you see is the preface by Jason Tondreau. After writing about how the book came together, he closes by embarking upon what is basically the character assassination of Gary Gygax and, by extension, the game's other founders. In short, they were made out to be culturally insensitive, sexist bigots, and probably racist too. And when the book came out, it was not long before one of the few remaining creators of Dungeons & Dragons reacted. As you can see here, Rob Kuntz wrote a pretty scathing response. You can pause and read the whole thing if you like, but for now I'm only going to cover the parts I've highlighted. He says, "This whole attack upon old TSR has really tripped my trigger. A 50th year celebration, and this is it. Of the original D&D authors and its supplements, Gary, Dave, Jim Ward, and Brian Bloom are gone, and that leaves me alone as the last man standing, the last author. Anyone who would wait until the majority of authors who created the game were gone to stick it to them in this manner is a vile snake. And just to complete the deed, do it on the 50th. Show their admirers who's in charge. Show them who's in control of the IP. They fear those times they had no hand in creating, and they especially fear Gary Gygax. His name sends shivers up and down their crooked spines. And if it wasn't enough to have hounded him in life, let's do a Houdini and trample on his grave. Disgusting slime. But it's not just Gary or Dave or us others. It's also about wanting to wipe out that success and claim it as their own. And in order to do that, the fandom must be attacked as well as that history. All of it must be purged and never again allowed to exist." Frank Mentzer had a few things to say as well. Now, Frank was not one of the original employees at TSR, but he did begin working there in 1979. Here are some of the highlights from his post. "Gary bashing has been trending. I think Gary's morals and ethics were notably superior. He worked to be fair, regardless of age, sex, beliefs, or whatever. I recall him hiring and defending Gene Wells, and later acquiring Barima Obong Ubusu for VP Finance at TSR. Sometimes he got mad, sure. Sometimes he said things he regretted, sure. As to the infamous quotes now being widely publicized, all taken out of context and milked for clicks. You ever exaggerate to make a point or play the clown to amuse others? He was a normal, smart, deep human mind, kind and considerate, a Jehovah's Witness and flawed. I knew him well, friends for 25 plus years. You can see the truths in the above." However, the controversy really exploded into the mainstream when Elon Musk himself got involved. He famously posted the following on X. "Nobody, and I mean nobody, gets to trash Gary Gygax and the geniuses who created Dungeons & Dragons. What the F is wrong with Hasbro and WotC? May they burn in hell." Then about a week later, he followed up by asking, "How much is Hasbro?" Now, that was back in November of 2024, and so far, nothing has actually come of it. But it certainly created a stir at the time, and some people at WotC probably had a few sleepless nights over it. Eventually, somebody asked Jason Tondreau if he or anyone else at WotC had foreseen the backlash to his preface in that book. He replied by saying, "Early in the book's development, the marketing team asked me what sorts of critiques we should expect and prepare for. And I and the editors agreed the problem was going to be from progressives and people from underrepresented groups who justly took offense at the language of OD&D. I didn't write the preface until late, and I wrote it to address these concerns. It never occurred to me I'd rouse the ire of the grognards. It's obvious now that I look back on it, but I just don't take those critiques seriously even now. Now, he could have just stopped there. He had made his point, and he could have just left it at that. But no, he had to close by saying this. I consider those people not worth listening to, so I didn't anticipate their, quote, outrage. So in other words, the entire old-school D&D fan base, the so-called grognards, are, in Jason Tondro's opinion, not worth listening to. And if you thought the backlash was heavy before, you can imagine the reaction that Tondro's follow-up comment brought. Here are several thumbnails of videos made at the time in which I watched. The reaction was so bad that the resentment lingers to this day. So fast forward to today, and the current head of Dungeons & Dragons has apologized to Luke Gygax for the insults directed at his father. And that's great. I am glad that Dan Ayub reached out to Luke, and I believe that he is genuinely sincere about it. Too bad Ernie Gygax didn't live long enough to see it. But apologizing to Luke repairs only part of the damage that WotC caused. Because it wasn't just Gary Gygax. It was the entire old-school D&D fan base which had come to his defense that was snubbed and insulted. And people have been talking about that part of this new development ever since. For example, Kevin Lamb made a post on X, part of which I've highlighted here. If this is true, Dan Ayub, then I can safely say that I speak for the vast majority of longtime fans of not just the original versions of the game, but also the original authors, Gygax, Arneson, Kuntz, et al., in that I was absolutely disgusted by the vile and patently untrue accusations made by John Peterson and Jason Tondro against those who wrote and played the earlier editions and the opening forward of the making of original Dungeons & Dragons. The fact that they literally trashed the very creators and contents that the book was supposed to be celebrating was one of the worst decisions that WotC ever allowed. Please consider recalling all unsold copies and completely scrubbing the names of Peterson and Tondro from the book. Replace their libellous text with proper and respectful introduction and re-release it. Oh, and please make sure that the problematic gods, demigods, and heroes is properly added as well, since that was a glaring and totally uncalled for omission. Then John De La Rose posted his own summary on his Substack, Fandom Pulse. Here is part of the article. Luke Gygax, son of D&D co-creator Gary Gygax, held a press event at the convention where he revealed that Dan Ayub, new head of D&D at Wizards of the Coast, personally apologized to him twice for how his family was treated by the company. The goodwill towards Luke does not automatically transfer to Wizards of the Coast, and Lamb made that clear. The grievances are specific and documented. Tondro, the lead designer on making of original Dungeons & Dragons, then made his contempt for longtime fans equally public, calling them, quote, not worth listening to. John De La Rose also made a video about the topic. Here's the thumbnail. You can go watch that if you don't want to read the entire article. What I want to do now is break down exactly why the old-school D&D fan-based grognard should still be listened to. What follows is the outline of a lifetime of gaming for a hypothetical D&D grognard. Let us begin by saying that our hypothetical grognard was born in 1970. And no, I'm not describing myself here, I'm actually several years older. Anyway, born in 1970. I began playing Dungeons & Dragons in 1982 after getting the Moldvay Basic set. They gradually migrated to first edition AD&D as they could afford to buy the books. They began playing 2nd edition AD&D while in college. During the 1990s, the 2000s, the 2010s, and into the 2020s, they continued playing D&D, the particular edition doesn't matter, as their family and career demands allowed time for. Now let's move up to now, 2026. Our hypothetical grognard is now in their mid-50s. Their children are grown, thus freeing up more time for hobbies like gaming. They are well established in life and career, which typically means more disposable income. They're beginning to think about retirement, which equals even more free time for hobbies like gaming. Based upon the average U.S. life expectancy, our hypothetical grognard could still have a couple of decades of gaming left in them. And grognards actually buy books and license digital products. They don't torrent them. And this is why WotC as a company, and Jason Tondro in particular, should retract the original preface to this book and issue a public apology for the attacks made on Gary Gygax and the old-school D&D fan base. The company should also recall all unsold copies of the book and then reprint it with a new preface, one that is worthy of what the book was actually supposed to represent in the first place. Another thing I've seen, and which I agree with, is that WotC needs to get rid of this disclaimer, which appears on every single listing of TSR-era D&D products at DriveThruRPG. I'm not going to read it out aloud here, you've probably already seen it anyway, but if not, you can pause the video and read it to yourself. But what I want to do now is justify the outrage over this book's preface by citing context and actual facts. I'm going to take each claim that Tondro made in the preface and show how he is being disingenuous at best, or at worst, it's just flat out wrong. Now, most of this material I've covered in previous videos. However, I recorded those videos well over a year ago, and I've gained many new subscribers since then. And I realize that when someone subscribes to a channel, they usually do not go back and watch old content. I'm guilty of that myself. So this is probably as good a time as any to revisit this material. So here's the first example. In the 1970s, historical war gamers in America were predominantly white middle-class men. It isn't surprising that they would dub a class of soldiers the, quote, fighting man. Tondro's complaint here is that the character class is called a, quote, fighting man, and thus was intentionally meant to exclude women. For context, here is the rulebook and the specific page he is referring to. This was published in 1974, and here you can see the whole fighting man thing. So, while Tondro's comment is accurate, I don't believe any harm was intended. In those days, and long before that, the term man, or mankind, was understood to mean everyone, and Tondro is old enough to know that. But to elaborate on the point, in June 1979, Gygax wrote this when talking about the development of the Dungeons & Dragons game. He says, the target audience to which we thought D&D would appeal was principally the same as that of historical war games in general, and military miniatures in particular. D&D was hurriedly compiled, assuming that readers would be familiar with medieval and ancient history, wargaming, military miniatures, etc. It was aimed at males. So, Gygax is admitting that during the game's development, he and the others miscalculated just who exactly the Dungeons & Dragons game would appeal to. There was never any intentional snubbing of women. The creator simply thought the game would appeal primarily to males, just like the other hobbies he mentions here, which D&D grew out of. And he goes on to say, within a few months, it became apparent to us that our basic assumptions might be a bit off target. In another year, it became abundantly clear to us that we were so far off as to be laughable. At least we had the right subject material and the right general approach, so 2 out of 3 and all that. Again, Gygax is acknowledging that the game had a much broader appeal than they had originally anticipated, and he freely admits to their mistake. But again, they were never intentionally trying to exclude anyone. They were merely writing for whom they assumed would be the game's core demographic. And in 1976, only 2 years after the game's release, they were already taking steps to make the game more inclusive for women. This article appeared in Dragon Magazine number 3 and was published in October of that year. As you can see, it introduces a new fighter progression table specifically tailored for females. You could argue that it's a clumsy attempt at making the game more inclusive to women, but at least it was a start. Moving on, here is another passage from the preface. But when, in the pages of Greyhawk, the description of the Queen of Chaotic Dragons includes a dig at women's lib, the misogyny is revealed as a conscious choice. So again, for context, this is the rulebook and the specific entry which is being referred to. There is only one king of lawful dragons, just as there is only one queen of chaotic dragons. Women's lib may make whatever they wish from the foregoing. Now, personally, I believe that this is simply a clumsy attempt at a joke, and that no real harm was intended. I believe it was a throwaway one-liner aimed at a contemporary to them cultural movement. The reality is that in 1979, the supposedly misogynist Gary Gygax hired a woman with almost no gaming experience to work in the TSR design department. Jean Wells, she was the first female game designer hired by TSR. After some back and forth correspondence with Gary Gygax during the fall of '78, she flew to TSR headquarters in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, in January of '79 for a 3-day visit. Despite her lack of experience, Gygax hired her as the first female in the design department. And a little further down, she was the inaugural author of Sage Advice, a D&D advice column that first appeared in the Dragon, starting with issue 31 in November of '79. So, later in the same year that he hired her, the supposedly misogynist Gary Gygax gave this woman her own column in Dragon Magazine. Something is just not adding up here. Continuing on, here is another passage in the preface. It's an unfortunate fact that women seldom appear in original D&D, and when they do, they're usually portrayed disrespectfully. Now, anyone who makes this claim against Gygax often cites as their example the Harlot table, found in the first edition Dungeon Master's Guide. It is included as one of the many types of encounters which player characters can find in a city setting. However, going back to that Frank Mincer post I showed earlier, he says this. In the Dungeon Master's Guide, we find the Harlot's table. That was a joke. Now, I would think that Frank would know because he began working at TSR just as the first edition AD&D was being released. And besides, as anyone who has a copy of the first edition Dungeon Master's Guide knows, the book is well over 200 pages long, and it is jam-packed with all kinds of details and minutiae on a whole range of topics. And if Gygax had been serious about this Harlot table, I'm pretty certain that he would have included a lot more detail to go along with it. Now, if you're unsure, I'm using satire here, but I believe it when Frank Messer says that Gygax was being satirical too. Moving on, here is yet another comment that appears in the preface. Slavery appears in original D&D not as a human tragedy that devastated generations over centuries, but as a simple commercial transaction. Now, the only passage I can find regarding slavery in the original version of Dungeons & Dragons appears in the supplement Blackmore. Specifically, it is mentioned several times in an adventure scenario called the Temple of the Frog. Here is the first instance. In further efforts to increase the numbers of frogs, the brothers have sought to increase the purchase of slaves for the sacrifices and raise the necessary revenue by trading their handicrafts and medicines with the outside world. Just for contextual purposes, the term brothers here refers to a religious cult called the Brothers of the Swamp. So anyway, yes, slavery is discussed here in terms of a commercial transaction, but it's certainly not meant to be a good or casual thing. If you read through the entire scenario, the characters are obviously meant to go in and destroy the whole operation, which of course would put an end to the slave buying as well. And let's not forget that only a few years later, TSR published an entire adventure campaign that centered around the player characters destroying a ring of slave traders. So, at no time does early TSR ever condone slavery as a mere, quote, commercial transaction. It is, in fact, presented as a human tragedy that the player characters are tasked with putting an end to. In my opinion, Tondro was really reaching on this one. Anyway, moving on to the next segment of the preface. The cultural appropriation of original D&D ranges from the bewildering, like naming every 6th level cleric a llama. For context, this is the rulebook and the specific page that he is referring to. As you can see, llama is the title given to a certain level of cleric. But what I really want to point out here is Tondro's hypocrisy regarding this cleric leveling table. Apparently, only use of the term llama gets him in a twist. It doesn't seem to mind that lower-level clerics are given Christian-based religious titles like priest or vicar or curate or bishop. And just as an aside, Tondro is incorrect when he says that 6th level clerics are given the title of Lama. As you can see, it actually happens at 7th level. Yes, I am nitpicking here, but Tondro was the one who brought it up in the first place. Anyway, continuing on to the next section. Gods, demigods, and heroes, not reprinted in this book, includes game statistics for sacred figures revered by more than 1 billion people around the world, where players expected to fight Vishnu, one of the principal deities of Hinduism, kill him, and loot his +3 sword of demon slaying. Well, to answer this question, all you need to do is simply look at the book being criticized. For context, here is the rulebook and the specific page Tondro is referring to. Now, WotC was so offended over this product as a whole that it wasn't even reprinted in that original Dungeons & Dragons book. But here we have Vishnu, God of Mercy and Light. And then skip down to the bottom. He also has a bow of curses called Sarangi, and a +3 sort of demon slaying called Mandaka. But let's address the criticism about characters fighting and looting deities. This passage is from the foreword of the same book. It's not the entire foreword, but it's the part I want to highlight. It says, "This volume is something else also, our last attempt to reach the, quote, Monty Hall DMs. Perhaps now some of the giveaway campaigns will look as foolish as they truly are. This is our last attempt to delineate the absurdity of 40-plus level characters. When Odin, the Allfather, has only 300 hit points, who could take a 44th level lord seriously?" Now, in case you're not familiar with it, Monty Hall was the host of a game show called Let's Make a Deal. And in Dungeons & Dragons, the term was used to describe DMs who were too generous in giving out treasure and experience points to their players. So what you can see, TSR is using this rulebook to call out dungeon masters who allow their players to become so powerful that they would actually have a chance at defeating a deity. This means that the answer to Tondro's question in that preface is no. The authors of this book did not intend for player characters to fight deities and loot their belongings. But just to drive home the point, this book, Deities and Demigods, is the successor to Gods, Demigods, and Heroes, and it was published in 1980. I've highlighted this particular comment written by Luke Gygax in the book's foreword. He says, "Thus, addition of these deities and demigods does not imbalance the campaign. Furthermore, characters who become a match for them are obviously to be ranked amongst their number, no longer suitable for daily campaign interaction, but to be removed to another place and plane and treated accordingly." In other words, Gygax is saying that player characters who are powerful enough to defeat deities should no longer be used in regular gameplay. To continue, this passage was written by the book's editor, Lawrence Schick. Talking about the book, he says, "Well, here it is, Deities and Demigods, the latest addition to the series of advanced D&D volumes. But what exactly is it? Let's see, it has a nice cover. Open it up. Inside, there are lots of pictures next to sets of stacked statistics. It must be just like the monster manual. There, that was easy. Now that we know what it is, we know what to do with it, right? Wrong." So first he admits that this book does in fact look a lot like the monster manual. However, he goes on to say that this book is not intended to be used like the monster manual. Instead, he says, DDG, for short, may resemble the monster manual, and in fact does include some monsters. However, the purpose of this book is not to provide adversaries for player characters. So there it is, the final nail in the coffin. Clearly, the original authors of Dungeons & Dragons never intended for player characters to actually fight deities and loot their belongings. Taken as a whole, it's amazing when you realize how easy it is to systematically counter every one of Tondro's attacks on the game's original founders. At the most cynical level, you could argue that Tondro was just cherry-picking and then misrepresenting everything he said, and all for the sake of pandering to the so-called, quote, modern gaming audience. And it's not like I had access to secret information in order to refute what Tondro wrote. Everything I've shown in this video is publicly available. As project lead for this book, Tondro had access to all of the same information I did. And he could have easily done the same research I did. He should have done it before he ever put pen to paper. A lot of damage to WotC's reputation with the old-school fanbase could have been avoided if only he'd taken the time to do so. Alright, well that's all that for now. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button. If you can, please leave a comment and let me know what you think. If you have not yet, please subscribe to the channel. If you know of a good place, please share the video, and anything to help support the channel, I appreciate it. Thanks again. Bye for now.